Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about all the books that I read in June of 2018. The quality of books I read this month was a little all over the place. I had some really high highs, some really low lows, and some books that were firmly in the middle. I am first going to talk about all the books that I actually did finish in June, and then save my discussion on the 3 books that I ended up DNFing until the end of the video, so if you want to be a part of the Grumble Fest, stay tuned. The first book I finished in June was a YA romance novel called When Dimple Met Rishi by Sanya Menon. This is a syrupy sweet book that takes place at a summer computer programming boot camp in California. The parents of 2 Indian teenagers attempt to set up their children, Dimple and Rishi, but only Rishi was made aware of this, and so when he approaches Dimple at a cafe and jokingly refers to her as his future wife, she has no idea who he is, and so she throws a drink in his face. Once this mix-up is cleared up, the two start to develop a friendship, and obviously something more considering what type of a book this is. This book didn't have much substance to it, but then again, it would be kind of silly to look for a lot of substance in a book that is clearly meant to be fun and succeeds in being fun. But I do have to say, I wasn't a big fan of some of the messages that this book was sending to the reader. First of all, Dimple is a very serious programmer, and she pointedly lets the reader know from the very get-go that she is not the type of girl to give up all her ambitions just because a guy has entered her life. However, the narrative doesn't deliver that same message. Once Rishi enters the picture as a love interest, very little attention is paid to the actual work that Dimple and Rishi are doing at the boot camp. I also really didn't like that this book is basically screaming at its probably very young readership that unless you're working in a field you're passionate about, that you are going to hate your life. I feel like we tell this to teenagers so much, that you must be working in a field that you're passionate about. But then when reality sets in and these kids graduate from college and they probably have to accept the job that's in a different field than what they studied in school, they're going to feel like failures and come to expect dissatisfaction. Let me tell you, it is infinitely possible to work at a day job that you're good at, that doesn't require all of your time and energy, so that then you can use that time and energy on your off time to pursue your passion projects. There is nothing wrong with that. It doesn't guarantee future misery. Sorry, I know that was a rant, but I'm just so tired of this idea and how pervasive it is. So anyway, yeah, it's a cute book, but not much to write home about. The next book I finished in June was my random selection off of my TBR for the month, and that was The Sisters Mederos by Patrice Sarath. If you watched my June TBR video, I was really crossing my fingers that I would get a fantasy book as my random pick, so I was over the moon when this was one of my 3 selections. It was exactly what I had been in the mood to read, so I absolutely tore through this one. In this book, we follow 2 sisters, Vivian and Tessera. We first meet them during their late childhood, during which their influential merchant family suddenly falls from grace, and the 2 are subsequently sent to a very severe boarding school. Now finished with school, and after all formal charges against their family have been dropped, the 2 sisters return home, hell-bent to discover who was responsible for their family's disgrace. Using their special powers, Vivian turns into a bandit when night falls, while Tessera is not only an extraordinary gambler, but also possesses long dormant magical powers. Both girls are eager to exact revenge. The story of this book wasn't as strong as I had originally hoped it would be, but it was certainly very entertaining. It has a real fantasy of manners vibe. So if you enjoyed Sorcery and Cecilia or The Enchanted Chocolate Pots, but enjoy a little bit of treachery and revenge, then I think you would most likely enjoy this book. It also has very snappy dialogue and pulls you through extremely quickly with a lot of action and very short chapters. In my opinion, this is a good one for summer. The third book that I finished in June was Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. I recently talked about this book and my reluctance to read it in my 10 most popular books on my TBR list. I was feeling reluctant to read this book because of how awful I found the marriage plot to be, but a few months back, Stephanie from That's What She Read had convinced me to consider it, and then the response I got to the 10 most popular books on my TBR video with people telling me how much I needed to read this book definitely convinced me, but I wanted to pick it up before I lost my nerve. And I can honestly say that I'm glad I did so. This is a multi-generational saga of a Greek-American family. Our main character is of the latest generation of the Stephanides family. Cal, formerly known as Calliope or Callie. Cal was born intersex, that is to say an individual who, due to genetic causes, was born with both male and female sexual organs. This is a very rare condition, and in order for Cal to explain how he ended up inheriting it, he has to back the story of his family up all the way back to the young adulthood of his grandparents. From that point, we start to move forward, going generation by generation, looking at both the individuals and the larger family. I thought this was a really compelling story, admittedly done clumsily at times. Some of the gender identity issues I could tell he didn't handle very well, but what I did think was really special about this book were all the characters. We get to follow them generation by generation, and so we come to know some of their seemingly nonsensical neuroses that even their own family members don't understand. After I finished this book, I really seriously considered making a discussion video about giving authors a second chance and how it worked out well for me in this case. But this is such a specific circumstance that I feel like it wouldn't make for a good example for a larger discussion, and I will tell you why. Part of what made this book great was what made the marriage plot so bad. And that is the fact that Jeffrey Eugenides is not afraid to draw heavily on his personal life and his family's history to craft his stories. Huge sections of this book are heavily influenced by his own family story and by his experiences growing up in Michigan. It lended a lot of authenticity to the story, and so it worked well in this case. But when he did almost the same thing in the marriage plot, in which he shows the main character, basically meaning himself, lusting after a girl in college. In that case, pulling from his own experiences could not have been more of a detriment. So I really wish I could say, after having enjoyed Middlesex as much as I did, that I've changed my mind about Jeffrey Eugenides. But now that I know how he crafts a story, I remain wary of him. On a much lighter note, another book that I finished in June was called Failure is an Option, an attempted memoir by H. John Benjamin. This was a very short listen on audiobook and was narrated, of course, by the man himself, who you may know as the voice of Archer and Bob from Bob's Burgers. I knew I needed to listen to this one as soon as I saw it was a thing. I am such a huge fan of John's. I think he is hysterically funny, and as an aspiring voice actor myself, I really look up to him. All that being said, there isn't much to this book. This is a collection of true stories from Benjamin's life that in one way or another illustrate how he failed at something, and the book as a whole is one giant meta joke that he even failed to write a memoir. While no one would ever accuse this book of having substance, it was highly entertaining, if only because H. John Benjamin has such an entertaining voice. My favorite story in the whole book is when H. John Benjamin and his father have a very heated debate over whether or not P.F. Chang's was a national chain restaurant. So if you like H. John Benjamin, it is worth picking up for some light fun, but I do have to say, if you do not listen to this book on audiobook, number one, you won't enjoy it as much, and number two, I don't get you. An actual memoir that I finished in June was Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. It ended up being a really sad coincidence that I had put Kitchen Confidential on my June TBR, since it was announced in early June that Anthony Bourdain had passed away. Before this month, I had never read any of Anthony Bourdain's books or even seen any of his TV programs, but after having read this memoir, I see why people felt his loss so strongly. This is Anthony Bourdain's memoir of finding the food world. I've heard a lot of people refer to it as unfiltered, but I feel that that word has a little bit of a negative connotation. So instead, I'll call it refreshingly honest, passionate, and revealing. In this book, Anthony Bourdain shows restaurant work for what it really is. Brutally challenging, but completely invigorating. And he's also not afraid to show every part of himself, which times can certainly be callous and even mildly egotistical, but he is also someone who engages so strongly in everything that he experiences. I really loved this book. Anthony Bourdain won me over in such a big way. I really enjoyed all the restaurant stuff and the running the business stuff. That was, of course, entertaining. But what was the best about this whole book was Anthony Bourdain's strong voice humming through the entire thing. I am certainly planning to go and read his other books as well as watch his show on Netflix while it is still there. The next book that I finished in June was my yearly reread of my all-time favorite book, that is Rules of Civility by Amor Towles. It is so weird talking about this book because it's so personal to me. I feel like if someone would ask me, why do you love this book? It would be akin to asking me, why do you love your husband? Because you would be asking me to point at and assign adjectives to feelings that defy words. I just love it. But in case you've never heard me or anyone else talk about this book, I will tell you what the basic plot of this book is. 3 people Two friends and one handsome stranger meet in a bar on New Year's Eve 1937. We then follow these three people, as well as a larger cast of characters, through the entire calendar year of 1938, with the center of the story focused on Katie Content. During the entire year of 1938, we see relationships develop and fizzle out between these characters. We see good fortunes come and go. And ultimately, we see how 1 year in one's life can ultimately end up being the keystone to all of your future endeavors. I am well aware that none of that sounds particularly inventive or magical, but the tone of this book is so elegant, yet so crisp. It manages to sweep me away every single time, even though this was the fourth time that I've read this book. Because this is my favorite book, I have discussed it a ton on this channel. I will link a video down in the description box below in which I discuss how one goes about choosing a favorite book, what qualities we look for in favorite books, and how I ultimately decided that this book is my favorite. So if you'd like to hear me talk more about this book, be sure to check that video out. The final book that I finished in June, before I go on to talking about the DNFs, was The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. I was very excited to pick this book up since it's a very hyped romance book at the moment. This book is about a hyper-intelligent woman who happens to have Asperger's syndrome. All of her sexual experiences in the past have been negative, but due to her mother continuously pestering her for grandchildren and her own genuine interest in finding a compatible partner for herself, she decides she wants to get better in bed. This leads her to hiring a male escort who she thinks can help her in her efforts. And of course, this being a romance, it turns into something more. The whole story is extremely reminiscent of Pretty Woman, and it is sweet and sexy and wonderful. It is so much fun to read. There is a ton of good stuff in here about consent, and the relationship that develops is a really healthy one. Parts of the story are extremely unrealistic, as you might expect, but I thought it was a really lovely experience. Now, to briefly talk about the three books that I unfortunately ended up DNFing this month, the first of those is Bright Lines by Tani Nandini Islam. I was intensely excited to read this book, so it was a major disappointment when this ended up being an entirely character-based novel focused on not very interesting characters living in Brooklyn doing Brooklyn things. I know basically every writer alive lives in Brooklyn and thinks that it's the center of the universe, but let me fill you in on something. It's not, and a lot of us are really bored of it. The second book that I DNF'd was This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which was my pick off of my Classics TBR for the month. I was really bored of this book almost immediately after starting it. It's about a rich white boy. That's really it. I have had such lukewarm reactions to all of Fitzgerald's other books other than The Great Gatsby. I'm really sad that it seems like that's the only one of his works that I'm going to connect to. And the final book that I ended up DNFing was, unfortunately, The Eyre Affair by Jasper Fforde. I was really gutted that I did not end up connecting to this book, especially because it was a buddy read with the lovely Amy Poole. But I guess the one saving grace was that Amy and I ended up being on the exact same page about this book and both ended up putting it down. The main character of this book and this entire series of books, Thursday Next, is marketed as a literary detective who is tasked to hunt down a criminal who is kidnapping literary characters from their novels. But while the synopsis of this book makes her seem like a literary Nancy Drew, Thursday Next is actually ex-military and is working for the literary police. So it ends up reading more like a police procedural than it does a bookish romp. This book also very jarringly alternates between serious discussions about war and political conflict, and then we'll hop back to talking about kooky elements of this world. For example, Thursday Next lost her brother in the war that she and her brother fought in, and yet she also has a pet dodo because in this world, dodos have been brought back from extinction. Why, you may ask? Because the author can. The villain of this book is also portrayed to be this super genius who is in essence made himself invincible. Yet when we meet him, he is the most mustache-twirly Scooby-Doo bad guy. It just left me flummoxed. As I have said in other videos, for better or for worse, I am a very literal type of person, so kooky for kooky's sake is just not my style. So for everyone's sake, I put this book down. So those are all of the books that I read in June. I'm sorry to leave off on such a grumpy note, but I do have to say that I am intensely excited about all the books that I'm planning to read in July. I specifically picked most of them to be extremely fun, that I can enjoy myself with. I am officially done traveling, so I can start to feel more settled in our new place, and I can start to enjoy some of the fun things I have planned for this summer. I really want to have a good time with everything I'm doing this summer, including my reading. If you've read any of these books, if you've heard about them, or if you're now interested in reading them after hearing me talk about them, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below, or you can find me on a variety of different places on social media. The links to all of my profiles are linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.